Just in order to correct the record, on something that that Senator Canavan asked, I invite the AER to come back to the table and just correct that evidence if they so like.
So my apologies, Senators, but when you had asked us about the wind output on the 27th of November, the reason I didn't have it in the original commentary that I was providing on the drivers of high prices that day is because wind wasn't a driver of high prices on that day. So the 4 units were off, the coal units, but the wind output on the 27th of November, there were 2 high-price events, one at 3 p.m, one at 3:30 p.m. on the 27th of November in New South Wales, and the wind output at those 2 intervals was 852 megawatts in the 3 o'clock interval and 936 megawatts at the 3:30 interval. So that's more like 30 to 34% rather than the 3% or so that.
Where did the 140 something come from then?
That was just a mistake. We were getting that in real time from the team, and they gave us the wrong number, Senator, on the fly. So I apologise for that. They are the actual numbers. The numbers that I referenced on the other days, though, were accurate. So, as I said, it was only 280 megawatts on the 26th of November at the high price event. But during the 27th of November, it was significantly higher at 852 and 936 megawatts, respectively. So we just wanted to correct that. And
no, very much appreciated. Senator Canavan, do you need that tabled, or you?
No, it's fine. It's on the evidence. Yep,
great.
Fine.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming back and for being so clear on that.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks for giving us a chance.
I now welcome representatives from the Australian Energy Market Commission. As always, thank you for appearing before the committee today. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today.
Anna Collier, I'm the Chair of the Australian Energy Market Commission.
Ben Barr, Chief Executive, Australian Energy Market Commission.
Thank you. If you have one, can I invite you to make a brief opening statement, should you wish to do so?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll just make a brief statement. Thanks very much for the opportunity to come back to this inquiry to respond to developments since our appearance at the first public hearing. We've been following the inquiry very closely, listening into the hearings and reading through some 80 submissions that the committee has received. One thing that we've heard repeatedly throughout the inquiry is the notion that the transition is moving too slowly and that the AEMC is moving too slowly. So we've received that feedback loud and clear, and we will continue to take it into account in our processes, our prioritisation and our decision-making. To provide this committee with further context, the number of rule changes that are submitted to the AEMC has been increasing in recent years. So we currently have the capacity to complete about 15 to 20 rule changes a year, depending on the complexity of each rule change and other priorities. However, we're now receiving between 20 to 25 rule change requests a year, which is an operational challenge for us at a time when many stakeholders want to see an uptick in the pace of change. So we have set ourselves a target to complete 25 rule changes and 5 reviews in this financial year, which would be a 30% increase in rule changes on the past 2 years. Achieving this target requires us to adapt how we prioritise, resource and carry out our rule changes. It may also be of interest to this committee to know that we are seeking additional powers for the AEMC. So a significant factor in the time it takes us to complete rule changes is the limit of the legislative powers that we have when it comes to those rule changes. So we're seeking 2 things. The first is for the AEMC to split a rule change and consider components separately. And the second is the ability to self-initiate an energy market rules spring cleaning rule change. These recommendations were first put forward by the ESB on a review of the rule change process in 2020. Splitting rule changes would allow us to move more quickly on some parts of complex rule changes while taking more time on issues that require it. And spring cleaning would allow the AEMC to remove or reduce outdated or unnecessary rules on a regular basis. This would reduce the overall regulatory burden on market participants, something that has also been raised by some stakeholders appearing before this committee. Finally, I'd like to highlight progress made since I was last here in October. Last week, we published our final rule to roll out smart meters across the national electricity market by 2030, preparing Australia's energy system for the increasing uptake of solar, batteries, electric vehicles and other consumer energy technologies. This reform includes the customer safeguards that senators were particularly interested in. I mentioned this in my previous opening statement as well, but it's worth reminding this inquiry that those safeguards came into focus late in our rule change process, but we were able to flex our process to consider these stakeholder views and the public interest within our statutory framework. We have also released our residential price trends report, which is the first one since 2021, and this analyses residential electricity prices over the next decade. And we have commenced 5 consumer-related rule change requests, which were submitted to us by energy ministers. These focus on delivering more protections for energy consumers through changes to retail contracts and assisting hardship customers. With that, I'll stop there and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you kindly, and I'll go first to our Deputy Chair, Senator Grogan.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for coming along today and staying for a lengthy period of time. At the end of November, you released a retail price trend report looking at electricity prices over the next 10 years. And could you just give us a quick summary of that? Because it looks quite positive for consumers.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, the purpose of the report is to seek to provide an understanding of what are the key drivers of residential electricity prices. We actually used to do this report out over a period of 3 years, and that was the last one we released in 2021. But with so much change happening, we took a step back and thought that it would be more valuable to provide a report that had a longer horizon. First of all, so that it could provide insights into what policy levers might have the biggest impact on impacting residential prices, and second of all, to have a sufficient lead time so that policymakers could take steps to give effect to preferable outcomes. So what this report shows over that 10-year horizon is overall averaged across the national electricity market a decrease in the residential electricity price of 13%. It shows that the biggest driver of electricity residential price volatility is the wholesale market, and so the supply and demand balance within the market has a significant impact. While we are seeing significant expenditure in the networks, because this is more stable and spread across a broad and increasing customer base, that has a less impact on the volatility of prices. We also undertook a number of scenarios to understand what were those drivers that would have an impact. And the main scenarios that we considered were delay in investment in wind, storage, hydro, and also in some of the major transmission networks. What that illustrated was that, again, the biggest impact was in the wholesale market, so a delay in wind and also some of the major transmission interconnectors had a bigger impact on prices than, for example, a delay in the investment in storage. Another significant impact was we considered what we call CER orchestration, or the way in which customer energy assets are used and interact with the market. That also has a significant impact on end-use customer prices. So in particular, we looked at the way in which customers may choose to charge their electric vehicle. So on the one hand, customers may adopt what we call convenience charging, which is in some ways you treat it like your mobile phone. You just plug it in when you get home and you leave it to charge. If everybody charged their electric vehicle between the hours of 6 and 8, for example, when there's already peak use of the network, we would need significantly more network expenditure. On the other hand, if we can have smart charging, where we've got customers charging in different times of the day, particularly during the day when there's solar power, or alternatively overnight, then we see significantly less network expenditure is required, and that has a big impact on end-use prices. The third thing that this report does is to consider a household's overall energy wallet. So we recognise that households spend money not only on electricity but also on gas, which of course varies by state, and also petrol. And so we considered the overall energy expenditure of a household and how that would vary depending on the ability of that household to invest in customer energy resources. And what we found was a household that was able to invest in an electric vehicle, solar panels, to convert its gas appliances, and also to adopt smart charging as opposed to convenience charging, could save as much as 70% on its overall energy costs within that period.
So in your projection, so you've just sort of laid out what those sort of critical factors might be. What are the initiatives, and I'm just thinking you've referenced your smart meter rollout piece just before. What are the initiatives that are going to assist get to where you're projecting?
So from an AEMC perspective, the most important area of work that we are focused on related to these outcomes is our customer energy resource work program. So yes, the smart meter rollout we consider to be essential because of the data that will provide both to networks who can then use that data to more efficiently plan and operate their network, but also potentially to customers who, having more information, will then be able to make choices that are to their advantage so they can lower their energy costs. Other aspects of that program have included reforms to better integrate customer energy resources into the retail market, so to allow, for example, a customer to have a different plan for their electric vehicle than for their regular usage. So, for example, you might be able to get a plan that says your charging your car is very, very cheap if you can do it during the day or in the middle of the night, but more expensive if you do it during the peak, to encourage more people to charge when it's beneficial for them to charge. And because you can choose when you fill your car with electricity in the same way you choose when you fill it with petrol, you might be quite happy with that, but prefer a flat tariff for your other energy usage, which is less discretionary. We've also about to release a final determination in relation to better integrating these energy assets into the wholesale market to ensure that the market operator has greater visibility of where customers are taking steps to reduce energy usage or to provide energy into the grid. And so it can therefore take that into account in its planning, and that will also save money for all customers. And finally, we're looking at a holistic review of the way electricity prices are structured for residential customers, which includes looking at the way distribution network charges are set, how they feed into retail prices, and how that turns up for customers in relation to both products and services. And in that respect in particular, we're very interested in understanding different customer cohorts, so customers who are able to access the assets I talked about earlier, but recognising very clearly there are customers who are not in that category, and seeking to ensure that electricity prices work for all of those customers and that we don't end up with a greater energy divide as a result of the transition.
That makes sense. So in terms of risks to the lower prices that you're projecting, what would be the impact if renewable development and storage development were to pause or cease?
So we specifically modelled scenarios where we assumed, so I should just take a step back and say that the report does use the integrated system plan as one of its key inputs. And so our base case is to start with the integrated system plan step change scenario and assume that assets as a starting point are constructed in accordance with where the assumptions are made within that plan. So we adopt a consistent set of assumptions. But then what we did was to assume, first of all, that all wind assets investment was delayed by 12 months as a kind of a way of getting a sense of what an impact of delay would be. So not that we expect that to occur. You know, some may be delayed, some will be on time, some may be delayed more than that. But on average, we said if every single one was delayed by more than 12 months, and then we looked at 3 of the key transmission projects and said, what if they were delayed because they're actually quite instrumental in connecting up new renewables? And so that was the scenario that had the biggest impact on the outcome of prices. We looked at both what the average outcome would be and the maximum, and I might ask Mr Barr if he could just check what the differential was there. And then the second scenario in relation to delay, as I mentioned, was to look at what if all of the storage, including hydro within the plan, was delayed by a period of 12 months. Now, interestingly, that had an impact, but it was less of an impact than the wind and the transmission. So I answered the question earlier about what policies would be important in order to achieve the outcomes that we are projecting, and focused on what the AMC was working on. But in relation to project delays, I think looking more broadly at where governments are focusing their efforts, I think the focus that's being placed on working with communities where infrastructure is being built, working on obtaining actual social licence through those communities, working on planning and environment approvals to balance the needs of the infrastructure with broader environmental planning needs, those will be important in continuing the investment in these assets of major infrastructure.
Yeah, that, the detail on the scenario impacts on page 15 of the report, and the wind and transmission connection delays, as Anna says, have the highest impact, with the annual average price change being about 6%, I'm just reading the graph, and the maximum being just over 10%.
Sorry, Deputy Chair, can I just check? Mr Butt, I missed the name of that report or that piece of work that you're quoting from.
That's from the Price Trends report that we released.
Price Trends
yeah,
report. Thank you.
That's right.
Sorry, Deputy Chair.
That's all I had. Thank you very much. That was very helpful.
Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I'll start with this report as well. I just wanted to clarify, it seems like the last version of this report was in 2021, is that right?
That's right.
Okay. In that report, you had trends in electricity prices falling to just over 25 cents a kilowatt hour for Australians. Why is it now 10 cents higher than that at 35 cents a kilowatt hour, the starting point in your current report?
So in that report, we looked out over the 3-year period based on the information that we had available to us at that time. One of the key factors that shifted between when we published that report and the outworkings in 2022 was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which had a significant impact on international coal and gas prices, which fed through into the Australian electricity market. So what we have done for this report is consider the information that is available to us now, where we have a shift in the assets that are operating in the market. We've looked at each individual asset, the way that it participates, undertaken detailed modelling to see how that will throw through the wholesale and contract markets to residential prices, as well as the network charges and the additional retail costs.
But you've got 2025, you've got the cost at about 35 cents a kilowatt hour. Coal and gas prices aren't particularly elevated now. Why is it at 35 cents a kilowatt hour? That the Ukraine explanation doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
That's based on what we see as the current assets and the way in which they are participating in the market. So, as I said, we modelled each year for the next 10 years, looking at the assets that, according to the ISP, will be participating in that year and assuming how they would bid into the national electricity market.
But I'm just trying to understand here. I'm just trying to understand. Right now, coal and gas prices are a little bit above their averages, but they're not excessively high. And you've got your projections just a few years old are 10 cent a kilowatt hour out, like they're 30% out. I'm just trying to find an explanation for why you got your forecasts a few years ago so wrong, when clearly Ukraine can't be the explanation because you're not seeing those elevated commodity prices right now.
Well, other changes have occurred in the market since that time, Senator.
But so, I mean, I'm trying to put, like, how much credence can I put in your projections when your projections just a few years ago were so wrong?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, the global energy crisis out of Ukraine did really alter those forecasts. When those
That's
forecasts,
past tense.
yeah, but you were asking about the 2021, and it was wholesale prices were coming down, so it wasn't that the price at that time was 25, it was actually going to come down. And so we did see elevated prices raising those. That's why we stopped the report, actually. We didn't predict a land war in Europe. And I think the other thing is the 35 cents is not a forecast. Like, so we have changed how we've done our
The 35
methodology.
cents is for next year, in a month's time.
Yes.
So that's roughly what people are paying now, is it? It'd have to be, wouldn't it?
Yes.
I think your terms of reference actually says for this report you need to have a base year of the current price. I mean, look, I don't want to get distracted on that. I might come back to it if I have time. But I'm trying to understand then, I mean, the only cogent explanation I've heard is Ukraine, but as I say, that's largely washed out. In your projections for the electricity price Australians will pay, it only bottoms out at about just below 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So why is that 5 cents a kilowatt hour higher than what you projected just a few years ago Australians would pay for electricity?
Oh, I think we've answered.
But what? Like, give me some, because that obviously can't be Ukraine. In 2032, presumably you're not claiming that Ukraine is still the cause of the price. Then, the whole thesis of your report is that electrification is going to lower prices, but they're not that much lower. If we're paying 30 cents a kilowatt hour, that's still a good 20% higher than what you projected they'd be at just a few years ago. Why?
Senator, what we have looked at what the current mix of assets is in the market. And so as a result of the modelling that we've done, this is the outcome that has been projected. We should point out that we don't regulate the prices. Obviously, the AER will set a default market offer. They do that on an annual basis. The purpose of this report is to provide an insight into what we think the trends will be, more than the actual point price, and what will influence prices, so that policymakers can take a view on things that they consider will be important in order to achieve price reductions in the future.
Okay, all right. Yeah, just saying, by 2034 then, wholesale prices are back over 10 cents a kilowatt hour, over $100 a megawatt hour. Is that what you're predicting?
So, as I said, we try and provide what we think the trend will be. So it's not meant to be a point prediction.
Oh, okay. They're not a prediction at all. All right. Okay. Well, I probably shouldn't put much weight in them anyway then. But my understanding is when I read this, is this the only report you've got? I've got like this PowerPoint slide for 38 pages. Is that the only thing you've released?
No, there's
a
modelling assumptions report on the
right,
website
so
as
I
well.
might check that later. I just haven't had a chance. Okay. So you might be able to answer some of these detailed questions. It would appear that you haven't factored in any costs to consumers of buying batteries or electric cars or the like.
That's correct. The reason for that too is because consumers will update, and it's really clear in the report and in the modelling assumptions report too. So, people buy vehicles at different times, and so we're really clear that we haven't done that, but people update their appliances, and so it's really clear that's one of the assumptions for the report.
Right. But isn't that, like, I mean, I've got to pay for these things if I want them. Why haven't you factored that in to conclude whether people are actually making much of a saving or not?
We consider those decisions are decisions for households, and what we've illuminated is if that you are able to buy an electric vehicle, for example, there's potential savings to be made from shifting from petrol to electricity. As Mr Barrs pointed out, people update their cars when their car is getting to the end of its useful life. They're making a decision as to what car they would like to invest in next. This will help them elect the type of car they may wish to use by pointing out the potential savings over the life of the car if you use an electric car. I mean, it's also looking at what is that. But that would be the same if you're buying a combustion engine vehicle.
On page 8 of your report, you've got as your second finding, electrification should reduce household energy costs. Like, that's very clear. Now, I know you've got caveats, but how can you conclude that when you actually haven't factored into the upfront capital costs of people paying to be electrified?
Well, it will depend for each household on their decision that they make as to which appliances they wish to invest in.
But why would you make that bold statement in big font, italic text, and you can simply not make that conclusion from your report because you don't factor in the cost to consumers of buying electric products.
But we tell people that, like, it's really clear.
That's in the fine print.
It's not in the fine print, and people have to change out their appliances and their vehicles.
I mean, there's a broader issue here, particularly relevant for our inquiry. I note that that a review of the ISP, which also doesn't factor in these consumer energy investments, found that that such an approach, and I quote, was unlikely to adequately consider the trade-offs between small-scale investments in CER against investments in renewable generation and storage. The review goes on to say that this is problematic from the perspective of the ISP's ongoing scope as a national transition plan, but also presents challenges for stakeholders who rely on the ISP to assess energy market conditions. I mean, have you factored in that feedback then in your reliance? This was in January 2024, but in your reliance of the ISP in your report, have you factored in these criticisms that excluding these consumer costs are problematic and don't present a very good then trade-off between different energy investments?
Sorry, which review were you quoting from, Senator?
I've got a review of the Integrated System Plan, final report, January 2024. I believe this might have been tabled in this as part of this inquiry.
Is this the Commonwealth Review?
I'm not sure who published it. It said the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. I'm not sure who did the work, though.
And sorry, what was the question?
Did you factor in these criticisms? I just read out the criticisms that the ISP's treatment of consumer energy investments are problematic. They don't factor in the trade-offs between different types of energy systems.
Well, that's really comparing the cost of investing at the customer and distribution level with the cost of investing at the transmission level. So, in effect, because we've taken into account the transmission investments that have been laid out in the Integrated System Plan, we are taking the same assumption as the Integrated System Plan, which is there is more investment at that transmission level. What the report is suggesting is if there was a better comparison, you might do less transmission and more consumer investment.
Yeah, but you haven't factored that in at all in your report. You've just ignored the cost to consumers of buying electric products.
I think you've explained the point.
I mean, honestly, I can't see how this report is worth the paper it's written on, really. I mean, you haven't provided a cogent explanation about your electricity price forecast. You haven't factored in the costs to consumers of buying electric products. What is the point of this report?
So the point of the report is to provide insights. It's not to predict the actual outcomes for our households.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then Senator Grogan's made this mistake many times as committee. She takes these documents as if they are predictions, as she just did in her line of questioning, and it's not unreasonable for her to do so the way that you present them to policymakers, because you require people to read into the fine print to realise that they actually aren't really worth anything. I just wanted to drill down into, I asked earlier, on page 12, there's a graph there of the breakdown of electricity prices. And it doesn't show changes to network costs, which surprised me given the AER's former evidence about a wall of capex coming, and particularly reports claiming that there's going to be increasing electrification use. It seems strange to me that network costs stay relatively stable. Why is that?
So these are per unit cost. So because we see an increase in demand, the increase in capital expenditure is offset by the increase in demand. One of the points that we wanted to make was that it's not only residential households that use the distribution network, there are also commercial and industrial customers on the distribution network. So it's the combined increase in demand that actually impacts the unit cost, which then flows through to different kind of customers.
Is that the increased demand for total residential electricity consumption?
So it's the total increase in demand on the distribution network. So it takes into account the fact that there are also commercial industrial customers who will pay for part of the distribution network costs through their prices. And this is only the prices met by the residential customers.
Yeah, see, I'm struggling to understand it because in the ISP, I referred to it earlier, the actual residential consumption from the grid stays relatively stable. I mean, there's high use of electricity, but they predict it coming from solar and batteries. Etc. I don't see how that reduces the unit cost of the grid because those customers using solar and batteries are not using the grid. So I just don't understand if we're going to have to massively expand the grid to take EVs, to take export of solar power at different times, as the AER has indicated, how would the unit costs fall when residential use of the grid is staying about the same?
because there's an increase from commercial industrial customers as well, and the cost of the grid is met by all customers who are connected to the grid.
But why would an industrial customer have to pay for the grid being upgraded on Witangara Street in the suburbs? I mean, that doesn't seem fair. Is that how it works? Is that how it works? So a factory would have to pay for the household wanting to charge their EV?
So the way in which the prices are allocated between different categories of customers is a matter that each network will submit to the Australian Energy Regulator through its tariff structure statement and is approved by the Australian Energy Regulator. So those prices do seek to reflect the different costs that different parts of the customer base will be bearing. I was just trying to observe the point that what we have looked at is the share that we would expect, based on the work that we've done, to be met by residential customers.
Yeah. Right. So they do, I'm just trying to establish: would the increased capex required to meet demand, your projected demand for households to use EVs, solar, batteries, etc., would that part of that cost have to be passed on to factories and industrial users?
No.
No. Okay. Well, then I'm coming back to my initial question, trying to explain why a stable use of residential use of the grid, as the ISP forecasts, would lower unit costs in the context of higher network capital expenditure.
Well, what we've used out of the ISP shows it's not stable, it is increasing. So demand is increasing.
Demand is increasing, but that's with solar.
Overall demand is increasing, which includes solar, electric vehicles, batteries. Batteries charge from the grid as well, so it's not just taking from the grid. So, overall demand is increasing. That's an important input into our report. We're happy to table our assumptions report. The point Anna was making was around the proportion. So, small business customers also pick up the low voltage distribution network. An increase in overall economic activity and demand of that means there's a lower proportion for households. But it is actually going up. That is one of our assumptions.
How much is in your assumptions and in this modelling report, how much is the capex base, the capital base of the distribution grid?
I'll have a look. I'll see if I can answer it now, otherwise I'll take it.
Okay, and then how much is it compared to today?
Senator, I might just add that the second scenario that we looked at in relation to orchestration is based on the different uses of the distribution network for electric vehicles in particular. So when I was talking before about the different ways that customers may choose to charge their electric vehicle, the two approaches that we compared were if all customers use convenience charging, where they do charge during peak period, or which would add significantly to demand on the grid, or if we are able to have charging occur at other times, in particular during the day or during the overnight, in which case we need less grid built, so less capital expenditure. So I think one of the points that the AER is seeking to make, and that we would fully endorse, is that the more we can spread out the usage of the grid through these new assets, the better that is. We don't need to build more network because we build to the peak. So it really is dependent on not so much how many people have an electric vehicle, but when those people choose to charge their electric vehicle. So it's why there's a benefit to offering a tariff that really encourages people to charge their vehicles, for example, during the day when we've got excess capacity in the grid, so that we don't have to build more grid. So that is a scenario that's got also a significant potential impact if more capital expenditure is required because of that approach to EV charging.
Now, how much does, in your modelling, I've got heaps more, but all right, I'll do one more and then happy to pass on. How much does in your price modelling here for this report, what are the prices that hydro bids into the system at?
The prices that hydro bids in, we based on, they have an opportunity cost, which is the cost of the water that they use. It is in the methodology paper, and I'm just trying to recall.
We go through in the methodology the different sorts of bidding approaches from different generations, from gas generation, coal, batteries, hydro generators, renewables. Hydro's bid using opportunity cost, which depends on the water conditions. And so I'm just trying to find... and this is based on historicals. So what we've tried to do here is look back on what people have bid in the past and use that. And so that's what we do for hydro. Gas generators bid based on the historical.
Yeah, I've got on page 7 here, hydro generation was also bid into the model using their opportunity cost, which is roughly between $8 to $20 per megawatt hour.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm told that they've been typically bidding at around $100 a megawatt hour currently. So that seems a little off.
That's not the only thing that we do. So that's one part of the energy stack. Right. So we also look at the forward contract market, and we also factor in price volatility. So we have a price volatility adder that looks at when supply and demand conditions are tight, and that would pick up that higher bidding into the system.
Look, thanks, Chair. This is why I don't trust modelling at all, but thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you both for appearing today. I've hopefully only got a few short questions. Just picking up on something that Senator Canavan said about electric vehicles, and you were talking about the time of the day that they're charging. You said that they were charging at the end of the day. Did I hear you right?
We haven't done an analysis of when they're actually charging. We were simply trying to compare the scenarios that if we saw a significant increase in demand during the existing peak, which could occur if everybody who buys an electric vehicle engages in what we call convenience charging, so comes home from work, plugs it in, charges during the peak. That would add to the need to invest in the network in order to meet that demand. So we are really looking at reforms that can incentivise customers by providing benefits to customers to charge at other times of the day, given that in the same way that you decide when you fill your car with petrol, you actually have a choice as to when you fill your car with electricity to a greater degree than, for example, when you might want to use your lights, your fridge or your air conditioning.
And am I right in, I won't put it any more than surmising that in the future EVs will be providing a lot of the battery storage that we're going to need both at household and grid level? Probably a lot more so than stationary batteries. Do you share that view?
That's certainly the potential for car batteries. They have a larger capacity than the typical household battery that we see today. We're very mindful, and it's one of the reasons that we use the phrase customer energy resources, is that these resources belong to customers, and customers will buy a car primarily in order to get from A to B. Now, we would be very encouraging of customers being able to use their battery either to store their own solar power and use it in their house at a later time, or take the step further to actually allow their battery to be used, for example, overnight to further support the grid. But there's a few important steps that we think are needed to support arrangements like that. One is the technical standards need to be met so that the batteries are integrating with the grid in a way that keeps the grid stable. But the second one is it's important to consider the customer protections that might apply. If, for example, you were to allow your car battery to participate in a virtual power plant where a third-party provider was coordinating provision of energy to the grid using your car battery, then you would want to be able to set the charge that you needed to have left in the battery or return to the battery at a certain time in the morning that you intend to use the car. You would want to have certain overrides so that you could ensure that you would always be able to use the car when you need it. And so one of the reform packages that the ESB recommended to the Commonwealth and other governments that's being taken forward through the CER task force is to look at the customer protections that should apply to a broader range of energy services than what the traditional service has got very extensive customer protections that apply to the sale of electricity to the home or to the premises. And so we think it's important as we move towards the potential for customers' assets to be used in this way, which can be really beneficial to the grid. And when we say to the grid, that means benefits to all customers. So to the extent that we can keep the costs of the grid and of utility scale investment down, then that benefits everybody. But we really need to make sure that the customer who owns that car is protected.
And I agree with you. We should be protecting as much value as we can for all energy users. which is not a question for you, but I'm absolutely gobsmacked that we're even thinking about turning off rooftop solar generation. Take that as a comment, not a question. Most of the evidence that I've seen, and this is traditional, going back pre-EVs, is that most people drive their car to work, park their car. It'll be there during the middle of the day when we've got zero or low negative energy prices. Isn't that a fairly simple model to look at and start adopting? And because the incentives are already there, the businesses that are going to be paying for the charging facilities, and if any electricity, if it's at such low prices, they're providing an incentive to their staff, which are then incentivised to work for that company. Plus, we get a lot of energy available for either the home or the grid. Are any of these things being accelerated? Because they just seem like low-hanging fruit to me.
So we're looking at a range of different types of charging and considering where we can look at the best way to facilitate that charging. So I would say, three broad buckets. There's at-home charging. Then, as you've described, there's end-of-trip charging or facility charging, and then you've got long-distance en route charging, where you might prefer to have fast charging. So I think there's trade-offs that we need to think about between slow charging or trickle charging, which is cheaper, fast charging, which is more expensive, but you have greater throughput. So a question, for example, for end-of-trip charging, or if you're parked at work, is if they're going to have one car in that car spot all day, then it's only going to have the opportunity that whoever's providing the charging facility only has the opportunity to recover costs from one customer, if you like. Whereas if you're able to change the cars out during the day, for example, at a shopping centre, then you've got more people who are accessing the facility and able to recover costs across a greater customer base.
Sure, but Ms. Collier, wouldn't it be accurate to say that, as we've seen with business right across Canberra, right across Melbourne, Sydney, right across the country, businesses will make that decision for themselves. It's not something that needs to be heavily regulated at this level. It should just be encouraged, incentivised, and use that free, negatively priced energy when we can.
Well, if businesses wish to consider investing in charging equipment and facilitating their employees using that charging and using that electricity during the day, then that certainly provides a benefit in terms of the way in which the grid's being used to charge cars. And if those batteries are then able to be used overnight in the manner that we spoke about earlier, then that provides a further benefit back to the grid.
And would stop having to, would lessen economic curtailment during the day. Similarly, what work is happening to switch hot water services from, those on-time services to charge at night when there's little solar, and charge in the middle of the day when there's a glut of solar?
That's a question that I think the distribution networks are considering, because they're the ones who have had the hot water controlled load charging arrangements with their customers. So I'm not across the detail of what any particular network is looking at, but I know that these are certainly issues that are being considered.
Thank you, Ed. If it's not a question for you, I won't push it, other than to say it's just frustrating that these things aren't just brought through at the greatest pace that possibly can, because they are going to serve us very, very well. Just some questions, if you could give me an update on the transmission access project, which is, as I understand, the one that was started under ESB, is now being handled by AEMC?
That's right, Senator. So we've now delivered a report to ministers, which will be considered at their meeting tomorrow. So I could give you a sort of a high-level, a quick history and direction of where it's heading. When the ESB provided its post-2025 report at the end of 2021, there was a recommendation that transmission access be put to the AEMC in a rule change, but at that stage ministers actually preferred the ESB to spend more time with stakeholders considering the possible options for transmission access. It is an issue that's been very heavily contested over a very long period of time. In fact, really going back to market start is to consider the way in which generators access and pay for or access the transmission network and the prices that they pay and receive in the market. So after the ESB was requested to do further work on it, we spent a lot of time with stakeholders seeking their views. First of all, on establishing that we see congestion as a growing issue in a heavily renewables-dominated grid because of the nature of the assets and where they invest, and looking at ways to address congestion in two timeframes. One is the investment timeframe, or where assets build in the first place, and the second one is in the operational timeframe, or which assets are being dispatched, so that we have the least cost mix at any point in time. Through that process with stakeholders, we developed up what we called the hybrid model, which was a model looking at a approach called priority access for the locational signals, and then an approach called a voluntary congestion relief market in the operational timeframe. When the ESB concluded, that work was referred to the AEMC to continue, and our remit, or our terms of reference, was specifically just to develop up that particular model, working closely with stakeholders, and return to ministers with recommendations about whether or not to proceed with that model. In the period that we spent working with stakeholders, I think there was a number of developments. The first one was that each jurisdiction now, other than South Australia, has developed a renewable energy zone policy, which seeks to do a lot of the work that we were looking at from the locational timeframe, which is to coordinate where, in particular, renewable assets and storage are locating within renewable energy zones, so to put them in places in the network where they're not adding to congestion and, in fact, are given a degree of access within the renewable energy zone, and have also, in some cases, the states have got powers to impact connections outside the zones to say, well, that one's going to have a negative impact, so we don't think it should go ahead, if it would impact the access of the assets that have invested within the zones. So that was the first development. The second one was that because we were looking at a novel approach which had a degree of compromise, seeking to meet the interests of a broader range of stakeholders, we did find some challenges with the design which were going to make it complex to implement and some also expensive to implement. And the benefits to be received were, particularly with the voluntary congestion relief market, dependent on whether participants were actually going to take up the opportunity to participate in that market. So we had a lot of stakeholder interest and I think real concern with the model that we were developing, and so we've reflected both of those developments within our advice to ministers.
Right. It doesn't sound as positive as I was hoping it to do, but I won't push you any further for obvious reasons. And Senator Canavan had...
finally, I just wanted to ask about this. I flagged earlier South Australia seeking to restart a couple of diesel generators. Are they... reports indicate they're applying to you for that. What's the status of that?
So what they've applied to us for, Senator, is a variation in the...
You're right. All right, sorry. Just logistics, only a couple of us here today, short-staffed. Sorry, yes.
Yep.
Yep.
It's a variation to the National Electricity Rules which regulate the ability of AEMO to enter into RERT contracts. So currently there's a restriction within the RERT provisions that say if you've been in the market in the previous 12 months, you cannot then enter into a RERT contract. And the two diesel units that you refer to, we understand actually were brought out of mothballing in July and have been participating in the market since that time. although what South Australia would like is an exemption from that 12-month requirement that would enable AEMO to use those units as RERT over the summer. And so we're considering that rule change request in accordance with our usual processes.
Right. So they have actually been operating since July, have they? Or?
Well, that's my understanding is the basis for the request to us.
Okay. So how long are you going to take to assess this request?
So we have the ability to use what's called an expedited process in certain circumstances, which are prescribed in the National Electricity Law. One of those circumstances are if we form the view that the rule is urgent, which is whether there's an imminent threat to the reliability or the security of the market. So we've published a consultation paper proposing that this rule change request be treated under the expedited framework, which is an 8-week timetable, on the basis that it's urgent. Under the National Electricity Law, there's a requirement for us to allow 2 weeks for objections to that proposal, and so we're currently in the objection period. If we receive an objection, then we need to form a view as to whether the objection is misconceived or lacking in substance.
So it could be as quick as 2 weeks away, the decision?
No, that will simply be the decision that we can continue on an expedited time frame.
Oh, okay.
The time frame, if we do continue, will be the end of January.
End of January. Okay, but don't they want these for summer?
So they've indicated to us that an important part of summer is February, so that if we're able to make the decision by the end of January, then that will still be of value to them.
When did South Australia apply for this decision from you?
We actioned it within a week
Yeah,
of receiving it,
I think so. We initiated it on the 28th.
Sorry, on the
28th of November was when we started it, and I think we got it the Thursday before that. So
you got the request from South Australia the Thursday before?
We're absolutely prioritising it as a matter of emergency.
All right. Earlier in the year, it was the Financial Review quoted Engie, the owner of these plants, as saying that one reason they'd taken them offline was because of the change in the proposed design of the capacity mechanism. Would it be another way to maintain the availability of these systems would be to allow the capacity mechanism to support this type of generation?
Are they referring to there's many different types of capacity mechanism.
That's right, but I think the previous one proposed by the ESB didn't rule out particular sources of generation, but the Financial Review reported on the 6th of February that a change in the proposed design of the capacity mechanism to remove any support for older thermal plants, meanwhile it eliminated the possibility of extra revenue, and it quotes an energy statement saying that, and I quote, "In the absence of appropriate revenue streams that recognise the capacity value of such plant, Snuggery and Port Lincoln are no longer profitable."
So that would be referring to a type of design which was under consideration by the ESB where assets are paid for their capacity whether they're operating or not.
Well, it just seems strange to me that we've ruled we're going to have a capacity mechanism which is solely renewables based. We're not even allowing gas, apparently. But we're potentially going to allow a diesel plant to slip in under the RERT. I mean, it just seems all a bit messy at the moment, how we're applying the rules here.
Well, our focus is on the national energy objectives, which require us to consider the long-term best interests of customers with regard to security, reliability, affordability, safety, quality, and taking into account emissions reduction. And we get to balance those in a way that we think best serves the long-term interests of customers. So that's the basis on which we'll be assessing this particular rule change.
Right. So why wouldn't we just allow them to bid to the capacity mechanism?
Well, that capacity mechanism, we don't regulate that.
Right. But what's your view then? Should we allow it to be in that? That would avoid the need for you guys to consider this change.
That's a view on government policy, isn't it, Senator?
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for appearing today. I should know it off by heart by now. If you have taken any questions on notice, the committee will report to the Senate on Friday, 20th December, and request that answers to questions taken on notice are provided to the committee secretariat by close of business Thursday, 12 December 2024. Thank you for...
Thanks, Senators.
Appreciate it. I now call representatives from the Australian Energy Market Operator, please.
That'd be great. Thank you.
I'll let you get settled and get some water. Thank you for appearing again before the committee today. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today.
Daniel Westerman, I'm the Chief Executive of the Australian Energy Market Operator.
I'm Merryn York, I'm the Executive General Manager of System Design at Australian Energy Market Operator.
Good, ma'am.
And I'm Rebecca Irwin. I'm the Executive General Manager of Government and Stakeholder Engagement at AEMO.
Thank you, Ms Irwin. Do you have an opening statement you'd like to read into evidence?
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Well, thank you, Chair and Senators, for the opportunity to appear today. I'm here with Merryn York and Rebecca Irwin, as just introduced. And at our previous appearance, we outlined AEMO's role and governance arrangements as discussed in the National Electricity Law and rules and the obligations guiding our work, including the national energy objectives. We also shared how we transparently engage and interact with our stakeholders. We provided insights to the committee about the Integrated System Plan, which identifies the optimal development pathway for grid-scale generation, storage and transmission, aligned with federal and state government policies. I acknowledge that the committee has heard a wide range of perspectives from stakeholders since then about our role and our work and the Integrated System Plan. And we welcome these perspectives. And we work hard to consult with our stakeholders. In the development of the 2024 Integrated System Plan, we heard from over 2,000 stakeholders, all of whom contributed to our thinking. I'd just like to clarify three aspects of our work in response to evidence provided to the committee. First, the role of government policy in shaping the ISP. The National Electricity Rules prescribe that we must consider government emissions reductions targets when preparing the ISP, and that we may consider jurisdictional policies. In practice, our approach is to include government emissions targets, for example the legislated net zero target by 2050, in the modelling of the ISP. In this way, the ISP provides the generation, storage and transmission, the investments that are needed to for the power system to meet these emissions targets at the lowest cost to energy consumers. And I acknowledge that stakeholders have suggested additional outlooks could be modelled in the ISP, but AEMO's approach is to provide information on the power system requirements to meet the emissions targets set by governments. Second, the costs that we model and why these could be different to other estimates. So the ISP costs include grid-scale generation, storage and transmission, and these costs are used to map out the optimal development path. They are not used to forecast prices or to evaluate the overall costs of the transition. We've been transparent about what the ISP is and what it isn't when it comes to cost, and we consult on and publish the inputs and assumptions that underpin our cost estimates. Third, how projects are evaluated and re-evaluated over time in the ISP. So as part of the ISP, we assess the cost and the benefits of proposed future projects, and they're relative to other options to meet the system needs. We see that when costs rise due to inflation or supply chain issues for one project, those same issues apply to the costs of alternative options. Now, this is obviously re-evaluated during the next cycle of the ISP or in a feedback loop if a project has passed through the RIT-T process. across all of our work, I'm confident in the value that AEMO delivers to consumers, to industry and to governments. So thank you for the opportunity to make an opening statement, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr Westerman. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much for coming to visit with us today. I'd just like to start by asking if you accept some of the criticisms that have been levelled at you through this inquiry, particularly in regards to your independence, expertise, consultation and governance.
Well, what I accept is that the energy transition is of great interest to all consumers and to Australian society, and I think that is a good thing. I accept that there are a range of different perspectives on how governments and industry and consumers should approach the issues associated with the energy transition. I also would point out that AEMO is committed to being open, transparent and collaborative in the way that we navigate our responsibilities as given to us under the National Electricity Law, rules and obligations, and that we seek additional perspectives on everything that we do. A good example of that is obviously the Integrated System Plan, where we have a consumer panel that provides input. We consult broadly. We publish everything. There are I'm not sure how many pages of materials and models that are available for this. And this is to provide information to interested parties so that they can have an informed perspective. I acknowledge that those perspectives will there'll be a range of perspectives, and I think that's healthy.
Thank you. Now, with the ISP, can you give us some details around the improvements following the review?
Sure, I might ask my colleague Merrin to provide that.
Yes, thanks for the question, Senator. I assume you're referring to the recent review that was conducted in 2024 by the DQ, the department, and which was considered by energy ministers earlier this year. That came through with a series of recommendations that to essentially expand some of the considerations that we make in the integrated system plan. So those predominantly relate to gas and the interaction between electricity and gas, which is foreshadowed in our ISP analysis, where gas generation in particular will provide a very important backup service in the future, where there may be circumstances where solar and wind and storage has been depleted and gas generation will be important. And so one of the improvements that we will be looking at, and which we're in the process of seeking to implement for the 2026 ISP, is specifically about what are potential gas development projections and developing what that might look like, both in terms of the way in which gas moves around the gas network, where gas-powered generation might be located, and how gas might get both be available for that gas generation but also be transported to that gas generation that may be required. So that's one critical aspect that we're looking at in terms of how gas that is used for electricity generation is factored in to the integrated system plan. Another major element for the improvements to the integrated system plan relates to consumer energy resources, and so this really relates to things like distributed PV, so rooftop solar PV, electric vehicles and other forms of energy support services that are located within both consumers' premises as well as within the distribution networks. And so that is wrapped up into a piece of work we're doing around demand forecasting. So how consumer energy resources are factored into the demand and energy forecasts that we use as inputs into the range of scenarios that we look at in the ISP. And so we are working very closely with some of the distribution networks to better understand the capacity of the distribution networks, the forecast of consumer energy resources, specifically around distributed PV and electric vehicle uptake, as well as the coordination, or what's been referred to as orchestration or coordination between those devices to help to, maximise the usage of that energy source, but also how that then coordinates into the distribution network and how that then flows through into more of the transmission scale network and the way in which that interacts with utility scale generation. So that's another key area where we're looking at how do we factor in the capacity of the distribution network, how that could be utilised to the maximum, and what other additions to the distribution network might be required to better utilise that service, as well as what the cost of that is. And so that's a piece of work that we're starting to explore, particularly in conjunction with those distribution networks, of which there are quite a few. So that's a big piece of work to consult with them on that. We are also, there's another range of things that are in the recommendations related to how clearly we can communicate the integrated system plan. It is a quite comprehensive and complex body of work, and so looking at ways in which we can improve how it's understood, how it's effectively is communicated to everyone that's now interested in things like the integrated system plan and the transition to renewables, how we could better be aware of and take into account things like community sentiment around the transmission and the whole transition of energy, including not just transmission elements but also other forms of generation that might locate adjacent to transmission or in conjunction with transmission, and how all of that can work together to make sure that we are communicating the integrated system plan in an effective way. And as part of that, obviously we've already started the 2026 ISP, so we've got a series of consultations occurring at the moment around our integrated system plan methodology. So that sets out how we would actually do that modelling, and therefore when we get that new information around gas, consumer energy resources and demand and energy forecasting related to that, how we will then use that in our modelling, and that consultation is currently underway. The submission's closed 22nd of November, and we're now in the process of taking on board those submissions and considering what that means in terms of the changes that were proposed to that methodology.
Okay, thank you. And any other reforms that are underway at AEMO?
That's a broad question.
That's a very broad question.
It is a very broad question.
I mean, a huge
but
part
in
of...
terms of your operation and functioning, planning.
Yeah, look, thank you for the question. AEMO is right at the centre of the energy transition and at the centre of implementing a huge number of reforms right across our operations. And that spans from the recently implemented integrating energy storage systems, so a real reform into the market that allows batteries to be able to participate more effectively in the national electricity market. Through to a range of other reforms, launched a new market in the Western Australia as well recently. So, look, as part of the current energy transition, you would have heard Anna Collier say before that a large number of reforms are working their way through the system. They end up at AEMO, and we then are in charge of implementing them because we obviously run the systems and the markets on which the national electricity market operates. So a huge number of reform. It's a busy job.
Yes, indeed. In terms of members of the public who might actually be concerned about your independence, how do you preserve and safeguard your independence?
Well, AEMO is an independent, not-for-profit organisation, limited by guarantee. There are three aspects of our accountability. So it's an independent company. The first is our accountability through corporate governance laws. So we are obviously a company limited by guarantee, and so our directors are accountable to those corporate governance laws under the Corporations Act. The second is that we are conferred functions, so we only do what is conferred upon us under the national energy laws, rules and regulations, be that electricity or gas, and it is our Board of Directors who are accountable for the delivery and performance of those functions. We are not accountable to members for the performance of those functions at all, noting that 60% of membership is held by governments and 40% by industry. And the third area is that we are accountable to energy ministers through the Ministerial Council, where I appear and represent AEMO on a range of functions that we perform. So in all of our activities, we are executing the national energy law, rules or obligations that are conferred upon AEMO. And our independence is dictated in those laws, rules and regulations. But we have an overarching objective, which is the national energy objective, and that is obviously to act in the best interests of the long-term interests of consumers with regards to price, reliability, security of supply, etc. And recently added is obviously the achievement of government emissions targets.
And so you are accountable to the ministers from each state and the federal minister, is that correct? Even though there's been some commentary about you not being accountable directly to Parliament?
Our accountability is discharged through the Ministerial Council, and that is all ministers. So that is where I attend. I provide semi-annual updates, and we provide those into the Ministerial Council. And I attend and provide operational updates as well as updates on implementation of reform, etc., and as part of the Energy Advisory Panel on strategic issues.
Thank you. And of course, each of those ministers is then accountable to a range of parliaments around the country.
Indeed.
In terms of your staffing and expertise, and we've heard commentary from Senator Canavan earlier that he doesn't put a great deal of store in projections and modelling from the energy market bodies. What is the kind of expertise that you have on your staff, the people who do the work to provide that material that you, as you say, you publish everything?
So I'm not sure the comment specifically, but I mean, in terms of, sorry, so the question was around what expertise?
Of staff, really.
Yeah. Look, I mean, AEMO is world renowned for expertise in energy system and market operation and planning. I've lived in the UK from 2014 to 21, worked across the UK, the US and Europe, and it is well known that AEMO leads the world in some of our engineering and planning functions. The way that we operate the grid here, it's a challenging grid and system to operate, unique in the world in many different ways. And to be honest, the reason I came back to Australia was to lead this organisation who are incredibly capable. We have some of the smartest engineers and economists in the world. I'm not saying that that's smarter than anyone else, right? But it takes a village, I would say, this energy transition. So one of the things that I'm actually most proud about is the way that we operate with industry and with governments in a very open, collaborative and transparent way. I think certainly over the last couple of years we've seen a real uptick in the way that we work with industry, and we talk a lot about the integrated system plan, but recently we've been doing a whole lot of work on how we operate a grid with higher and higher penetration of renewable energy, and that work, while coordinated through AEMO, really relies on the expertise right across industry. So I think while I'm proud of the capabilities that AEMO has, I also think we have a terrific industry here who really know what they're doing, and it's the collaboration and alignment that enables us to be successful.
Right. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Senator Canavan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I just go to what I was asking earlier about the RERT last week? How much was used and what was used?
So the direct answer to the question, we published a notification yesterday, as is our obligation, that we use 65 megawatts of RERT for a total cost of $3,557,000. Now,
350, sorry?
$3,557,700.
Just say that again, sorry, I just $3 million.
$3,557,000.
Yep.
700, so 3.5577.
700, yeah. Okay, sorry.
And that includes, I'll just say that includes the cost of pre-activation as well as the actual RERT that was available, that was used at the time. If it's helpful to expand on the situation last Wednesday, I'd be happy to do that, Senator. But the pre-activation is done during the day beforehand, so it sets up RERT providers to be available for demand response. And then the actual activation during periods of low reserve is undertaken on as is required. What happened last Wednesday, which again I'm happy to expand upon, is that the forecast early in the day was significantly more challenging than actually panned out at the period of low reserve, and so we deployed less RERT than we pre-activated.
How much did you pre-activate?
I don't have that number, but we will include that in the RERT report that we
Could you take that on notice for us so we can have it?
Well, we'll publish that in the RERT report.
Yes, but we might not get that before we need to report. Could we get that figure, I think, by the 15th or something we're giving people to? Could you take that on notice?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, okay, thank you. 12th, I think. So what was the 65 megawatts?
I don't have that detail.
What do you mean you don't have the detail? Surely your body knows who you're contracted with.
I know who we're contracted with. And
okay, so that's what I'm asking. Who were the RERT providers? Is that the word?
What I don't know is who was activated at the time.
Okay.
And so, for example, if I give you an example, and I'm not being obtuse, I just don't have it. I think it was broadly virtual power plants and demand response in that side.
Right.
But, for example, what it wasn't was the aluminium smelter, which was pre-activated.
Okay.
But was not called upon.
So the aluminium Tomago was pre-activated?
Tomago was pre-activated, yes, and ready and available, but not used during the time. And what we observed was that Tomago withdrew themselves out of the market.
Right.
Which is why they weren't.
Oh, so Tomago actually withdrew itself out?
Yeah.
I did see a big dip there. That was just presumably because of the spot price at the time?
I couldn't speak to why. But
okay. That's... All right. Did any of the money go to Tomago then, the $3 million? Do the pre-activated guys
I have to take that one on notice. I imagine there's a pre-activation charge. So
there is, okay. But typically there would be when you pre-activate someone, they get some
typically,
funding.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
to be prepared.
Pre-activation charge, yeah.
Okay, all right, we'll take that on notice as well. And so you said you think most of it's virtual power plants. What does that mean for laymen?
So what, I mean, if you just give me 1 second to explain what RERT is. Obviously it is, in New South Wales, we have around about 900 megawatts of what we call reliability emergency response trader. I know you know this, which we utilise in periods of very high demand and low reserve. We obviously don't want to intervene in the market, but when there is what we call a forecast lack of reserve too, so that means we are only the single largest contingency away from load shedding. We use RERT to increase the reserves available. Typically, that is not additional generation. Rather, typically it is demand response. So it is large industrial consumers like the smelter, for example, but there are plenty of others who are able to reduce their demand for a short period of time. Now, a virtual power plant, and I will take on notice what that is, so I'm not saying it was all virtual power plants, but it's an aggregation of smaller units, a smaller demand into that then sort of aggregate up to what's called a virtual power plant to reduce.
It's still the taking out of demand from the system effectively, of load, is it, the VPP?
Well, when you say taking, they're paid for it. So these are commercial contracts.
Yeah. But it's just not one big plant, the VPP.
No, that's right. So there's a whole
they work together
of providers.
Okay. All right. So we heard earlier there's a proposal to add diesel to the RERT from South Australia. Are you providing any advice on this proposal? Or?
So that is, and again, those two diesel plants from ENGIE, which were mothballed and taken out of the market from, I think it's the 1st of July this year, there is a rule change proposal from the South Australian Minister to be able to use those for either interim reliability reserves or RERT. Let's effectively call it the same thing. It's just a different contract. I know that rule change is being considered by the AEMC, as Anna Collier mentioned earlier. We have some discussions with South Australia. We have some discussions with ENGIE. Yes, I'm broadly aware of it, but I don't have any.
Do you think it's needed? Or?
Well, in the electricity statement of opportunities that AEMO published in August this year, what we projected were that if investments weren't delivered in time, that there would be shortfalls to the reliability standard in South Australia, in Victoria and in New South Wales. The shortfall in South Australia, if I'm right, was around 200 megawatts. I think that's right. For this summer, the way that the rules are set up is that we then make an invitation to tender for people to provide that emergency response reserve, basically, which we send out to the market, and ultimately it is the government's decision. It's each government's decision, South Australia in this case, Victoria for Victoria and New South Wales for theirs, as to whether they actually procure that to then meet the reliability standard as projected in the ESOO. So that is a decision for South Australia.
Okay, well, all right, I'll leave it there. I mean, given those shortfalls you predict in the latest ESOO, do Australians have to get used to not being able to use their dishwashers and air conditioners at hot times of summer?
Well, what we've been very clear about in all of our documentation and messaging, be it the ESOO, the Electricity Statement of Opportunities I just mentioned, or the Integrated System Plan, is that Australia's energy transition is happening at pace. 10 coal-fired power stations have retired since 2012, and that energy needs to be replaced by the cheapest, the lowest cost form of new build energy. We consistently call for investment in all types of generation. That includes renewable energy. It also have been very vocal about the need for gas power generation and gas supply throughout the transition. And our message to investors and to governments is that that investment is needed to be delivered so that Australian consumers continue to have access to reliable electricity when they need it.
Okay. Just a technical question on the ISP. What is the shadow carbon price that comes out of the output of the first phase of the single-stage long-term modelling in the ISP?
Thank you for the question. So when we model the ISP, we actually look at carbon and emissions reduction as an input into the ISP. So we, as you know, it's a scenario-based plan. We have our kind of slower scenario, our middle scenario, and a more ambitious scenario, and they are implemented through differences in terms of the pace at which carbon emissions are removed from the electricity system, and so we don't use a shadow carbon price as such. We actually use a carbon budget process where we're setting different levels of carbon emissions that are allowable over the analysis window between now and the end of the modelling period in 2050. And so those different carbon budgets are actually determining the pace at which decarbonisation of the electricity sector is occurring.
But the carbon price would be an endogenous output then?
Well, depending on what the
so that's what I'm asking.
The cost of that is...
What's the endogenous outcome of the carbon price given the carbon budgets you set?
Well, it's not something that we actually use in our modelling. We actually
I'm not
use
asking whether
the
you use
level
it or
of
not. I'm just
carbon
asking for the
emissions.
figure. I'm asking for the figure.
Well, it would be different in the different scenarios. It's not...
Okay. Well, I'm happy to take as many years, as many scenarios as necessary. What is the price?
I don't have that figure to hand because it's not something that we use in our modelling. It's something that would be a back calculation.
Maybe we're here for a lot longer, so
input.
maybe someone could go and track that figure down. To make it easy, if you want a simple figure, just what is it in 2050 for the step change scenario? So that we've established there is an endogenous carbon price.
Well, there would be an effective price, but the way in which we model it, it's not used in our modelling.
So could I just get the figure for, by the end of today, we've got you till 1:30, it's an hour and a half, surely someone's a lunch break, surely someone can track down the figure for 2050 in a step change scenario, please. Okay. Now, Chair, I've got plenty more questions, but I'm mindful we're due for a break at 12. What do you want to do timing-wise?
Break. I've got some questions, but I'd suggest let's have a break.
I'm just mindful I don't necessarily move on to another topic if I'm going to be pulled up.
All good. I will give you latitude. On that question on notice, are you happy to get it?
Yeah, I'm happy to get it
later.
Well, I'd like it today. It's such a simple question that I'm just worried timing-wise for our report. Well, I just have one very simple question then.
Please.
It should be able to be tackled quickly. Transgrid seemed they were apparently Transgrid was on the membership list published on your website, but apparently they're no longer listed. Is that someone's informed me of that? Are they still a member of AEMO?
So, AEMO is I'll start again, not-for-profit company limited by guarantee. 60% is governments, 40% is industry.
Yep.
Around 100 companies form part of that 40%. I'm not exactly sure who it is, but Rebecca, I think, can look up.
They're not there. I've just checked again. They're not on your list of industry members, but apparently they used to be. So I'm just wondering.
Industry members come and go. I don't keep a track of who is a member and who is not.
Okay.
Effectively, there are two rights that industry members have. One is a change to the Constitution, and so if there is a proposed change to the Constitution that requires a 75% supermajority, so that's obviously more than the 60% government's stake. And secondly, if there is, they also get visibility on our the proposed directors that get then decided by the Ministerial Council.
Right.
So, I mean, they're the two areas where members have input. We do see members at our AGM who obviously turn up to vote, but membership of AEMO is not something that we spend much time on, if I'm honest.
Okay.
So I couldn't tell you whether Transgrid are or are not, or whether they have come on or off.
Okay. Why is Westpac a member?
Well, any body who has interest in and participates in the energy markets is eligible to become a member. I couldn't speak exactly to Westpac.
What does participate mean? I buy electricity. Can I be a member?
Well, it's a market participant.
Okay.
Right?
What does that mean? What do they have to do?
They would be either buying or selling wholesale energy on the wholesale energy markets.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I imagine that Westpac fulfil that condition.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, it is 12 o'clock, so up to you, Chair, what you want to do.
Yeah, let's take a break. Mindful of not keeping you any longer than necessary. So if we keep that to 20 minutes, does that suit, or half an hour, which would...
Yeah, half an hour would allow us to get some food, if that's all right.
Let's make it half an hour. We'll restart again at 12:30.
Thank you.
Thank you.